Graphics cards, man. I cannot tell you how many times I've just been so disgusted by scrolling through eBay, looking for any somewhat decent deal, only to find out that things are still going for 2 to 3 times MSRP pretty much across the board with a few exceptions. Now, I have in this video broken down and evaluated the value of 64 graphics cards, okay? We're talking RTX 3060 Ti, GTX 1660, RX 570, 470, 460, 580, R9 380X, GTX 970, GT 710, Titan V, Titan X, Titan RTX, Jesus with the Titan names. Anyway, 64 cards, okay? And these are all cards that I think would be somewhat on a gamer's radar depending on their budget. And of course, these budgets range from anywhere from $50 up to $2,000-$3,000, depending on how you look at it. If you look at MSRP or if you look at what these are selling for currently on eBay. So a ton of data to sift through in this one. This is going to be an extremely dense video, but I think it's going to be palatable enough and should give you a good idea of which cards are worth buying if you absolutely have to buy something right now. Now, I've been telling my viewers for the past few months they should not let their lack of patience get the best of their wallets. What I mean by that, if you're really sick of the card you're on now and you're tired of waiting for prices to come down, you're gonna go out and just spend twice, 3 times what you should, hundreds if not thousands of dollars more than you should to buy that newer, sweeter card, just because you can. It makes no sense financially, and unless you're making a ton of money by utilizing that graphics card, and one of the ways that it can actually be utilized effectively, mining is probably the biggest one at this point. I hate to say that, but it is. Maybe you're a Twitch streamer, maybe you're a tech reviewer, whatever, you can justify it, it's a business write-off, etc. Fine. But for the most part, us casual gamers, we don't need to spend 3 times what we normally would for a better card when the card we have currently is, let's be honest, most of the time good enough. Now, if you have a GT 710, that's not very good. You might want to consider buying one of these cards that we're going to talk about in this video. Okay, enough with the suspense, stay with me. Corsair's 5000 series cases provide exceptional airflow and plenty of mounting space for up to dual 360mm radiators in multiple locations. The sleek aesthetic will complement any build, and the variety of models offered will cover multiple PC budgets. If you're looking for a mid-tower that pretty much does it all, consider the Corsair 5000D, 5000D Airflow, and 5000X IQ variants via the link below. All right, so I'm gonna blast you guys with a bunch of data right out of the gate. I apologize, it might be a bit overwhelming, but I'm gonna try to quickly explain what you're seeing. So I'm gonna share my screen. It's just gonna be an Excel window. And here we go. So what I have done, okay, and I've double checked with the guys who run 3D Mark Time, so I've actually gotten into contact with them. I asked them what they meant by mean when they show the mean score for a certain card in their 3D Mark Time Spy archive. You can actually look at all of the benchmarks that have been uploaded to their database. You can see all of those scores, what CPUs they used to get those scores, etc. Obviously, in this case, we're just looking at the graphics score because the overall score and the CPU score, the physics score, are determined by, at least in part, the CPU. We don't want that. So these scores you're seeing in this column, and it goes down quite a bit, you can see there, are all pulled from 3D Mark Time Spy's archive. Now, I asked about the mean because what a lot of people will do with especially these higher end cards, like the RTX 3090, they will extreme overclock these, LN2 overclock. They're going for the Hall of Fame scores, right? Just a crazy endeavor, very fun to watch, but not something for me. And those can obviously skew the mean. So the mean is more affected by outliers, which would be those very high scores, than a median would be. And I asked them about showing a median for all of these cards, and they said more or less what these scores represent are those that are more representative of what a typical user would get. So the outliers aren't necessarily included, they're not influencing this kind of data. So I would say it's a fair-ish representation of these cards' performances. Now, keep in mind, some of these cards, especially when we're talking about AMD versus NVIDIA, some of these cards will look better in Time Spy than they would in some random game, and some games will favor AMD, some games will favor NVIDIA, so there's always going to be a bit of bias, and obviously I can't account for every benchmark suite out there. I just picked Time Spy because it was the easiest place to gather data. So when you see the 6800 XT scoring slightly higher than the 3080, not a huge deal. Some would say this is within the margin of error, and when we look at the prices of these at MSRP, it makes sense that the 6800 XT is the better value card. So this column here represents value. The higher the number which is a ratio of price and score, right? It's the price to performance metric. The higher the score, the better the value, which means this is a card you should consider, especially in this price range, if you want more bang for your buck, which is what a lot of us are looking for. I even included a little chart here to the right that will show you how these cards rank out of 64. I believe there's 64 cards in here. So this is 60 out of 64. I'm not sure why it's in ascending order, but anyway, this is the 4th or 5th best card in this list from a value perspective. Now, the best card outright from a value perspective was the RTX 3060 Ti. Now, remember, we're talking about MSRP prices here, okay? Market suggested retail prices. Those are a thing of the past, my friends. You'd have to be on a different planet to find any of these cards at or near MSRP, any of these new cards, I should say. But with a score of roughly 30, that puts the 3060 Ti at the best value card on this list. Now, I did not include the 3060 because at time of gathering all of this data, which took several weeks, mind you, not necessarily the MSRP part, but the eBay prices, which I'll show you in a second, the 3060 wasn't out when I was gathering this data, so that's why it's not included. I imagine this would be pretty close to, if not higher than, the 3060 Ti. Anyway, you can see that there are some cards on this list that are absolutely awful value for money cards. The Titan X, for example, is the 5th worst card in this list at $1,000 with only a times by graphics score of 5319 roughly. Yeah, that's not a very good ratio, results in a 5.32 on our chart, which means it's 5th worst. Now, the worst card on this chart is actually the original Titan, which MSRP'd at $999. It makes sense, though, that the older cards, at least on the MSRP chart that I'm showing you here, score worse, because as the technology improves, right, with each generation, the efficiency improves, the prices tend to either stay stagnant or come down a bit, and that's good for us end consumers. It also means that the values of those cards go up. Now, this next chart I'm about to show you is pretty much the same one, just sorted. So the top card will be the best value card. That should be the 3060 Ti in this case. The bottom card in that chart will be the Titan. And here we go. So RTX 3060 Ti, you can see our MSRP $400. That score of 12,000 is pretty dang good. So we're getting a really high score for not much money relatively up front. That gives us a value of 29.91. And there's a Titan down there at the bottom. 2868 for $1,000 is a pretty awful value. Now, this third chart includes eBay sale prices, not market suggested retail prices, which means that these will be more representative of what the average shopper would experience today, give or take a few weeks. I think I gathered most of this data. It was 3 weeks ago, and I think I got the last few cards 2 weeks ago. You ideally want to have this data all gathered within the same time frame, but there's so many cards here, it was difficult to do that. Anyway, you can see that these cards are still sorted from best to worst in terms of MSRP, but when we replace MSRP with ESP, which again is eBay prices, we see that those values change drastically. So the 3060 Ti, which was originally over here, a 30 on the value scale, is now only a 9, which actually places it below average on this chart. So with the ESP being 1,300, MSRP at 400, that's give or take 3 times what the card should be selling for. Triple MSRP. And that effectively divides the value of the card by 3, which means that your values drop from 30, where it was at the top, to under 10, which means it's somewhere closer toward the bottom. Actually, if you're buying a 3060 Ti in 2021, assuming nothing drastic has changed since time of filming, you're kind of sort of getting ripped off with respect to other cards you could be buying when looking at this through a value lens. So you can see most of these modern / semi-modern cards are either okay or bad deals with respect to other cards in this value analysis. And this entire video is about value, okay? So it's not about the best performer or the worst performer. It's just about performance per dollar. You can't really have one without another in this kind of analysis. Actually, the 3080 is one of the worst deals at this price here, roughly $2,200, again, as of time of collecting this data. So what these 3080s were going for. Really high 3D Mark times by graphics score, but with the price that's just that much higher, that brings this value down to 8, which makes it one of the worst deals on this list. Now, some decent deals. I'll run through these first. You can see these are highlighted in either a light green or a dark green. The RX 570. a lot of people are going after the 580 and the 480, right? They're the 80 series cards. They're better, so they've got to be worth a lot more. They're going to be in higher demand, and people are paying $300-400 for 480s and 580s as of now. But 570s, I've found, with few exceptions, are going for low to mid 200s. And you're going to have the 4 gig versus 8 gig debate. I tried to specify in the 1060s case. I think we'll see that later. But for the 570, a 4 gig is fine. I specified with the 1060 because 3 gigs, that's cutting it really close for a 1060. A card is as capable as a 1060 and 1080p. But for a 570, at this point, if you're desperate for a card, the 4 gig is just fine. And I think that for this price, it's a pretty decent deal. Another card that performed quite well, RX 470. Pretty much the same card. You can actually flash a 570 BIOS onto a 470 GPU. It's not really going to change much. But yeah, these are actually selling for a bit less, and I think it's because people just see the 4 instead of the 5 and think that it's that much more obsolete. But because these are going for roughly $200 on average on eBay as of time of filming, the value goes up to about $18. That's not bad. Now, to be clear, a 470 for $200 a year ago was pretty freaking awful. You could buy these cards all day for 60, 80, 100 bucks. Miners especially were offloading these things. They just wanted to get rid of them. But in this current market, again, with respect to every other card on this list, which I think is fairly comprehensive, it's a better deal than those cards. That's all this graph is saying. It's not saying that it's a killer deal right now, better than it's ever been. It's just saying that with respect to the other cards in this list, it ain't bad at $200, okay? So if you have to buy a card right now, this is one to strongly consider if you're a 1080p gamer. We've got the 6900 XT right here in case you're interested. It is going for about $1,900 to $2,000 on eBay with a really, really high 3D Mark Time Spy graphics score. That only brings us to just under 10 on the value scale. So it's slightly orange, which means it's slightly below average in terms of price to performance there. Now the RX 590 is another card that's actually doing quite well. I feel like the 580s, because it was so much more prevalent, is being targeted quite a bit. But the 590 is kind of flying under the radar. There aren't many SKUs, there aren't many of these cards for sale on eBay, but you can find them for around 300 bucks. At least with respect, again, to other cards. I want to say this because I feel like people are going to just take this and extract what they shouldn't from the video. It's an okay to decent deal. Now there are a few awful cards in this list that you should not consider under any circumstance, followed by a really good one. First up, this GT 1030, right? A score of 1088, 3D Mark Time Spy graphics. You're paying 150 bucks for it though, and that brings this value down to seven and a quarter. That's not good at all. What's even worse though is the RTX 3090. People are spending $3,000 on this card. I mean, yeah, you're gonna get one of the highest Time Spy graphics scores in existence, but for $3,000, it results in a pretty awful value. Now, a card really worth considering if you're a 1080p gamer and you're desperate for something now is the R9 380X. This card is flying under the radar, folks. It is a true champ amongst just ripoffs right now. Yeah, it's not super powerful. I mean, look, with respect to 3D Mark Time Spy, it's only roughly 3 times as powerful, 3 times more powerful than the 1030, but you're only paying 120 bucks for it, right? So that means that you're getting a card for less than the 1030 that's 3 times as powerful as the 1030, which results in pretty good value. That's a 25, folks, one of the highest on this list. Actually, 3 standard deviations from the mean here. I think this list goes back as far as Kepler for NVIDIA, so the Kepler architecture, which is like the GTX 700 series cards. I think we only go back as far as the 470, 484 AMD. Actually, no, we go back further than that. We go to the R9, we just talked about the R9 380X. Which is a leap before that. We even touched on Hawaii architecture with the R9 series. Or is it Tahiti, Hawaii? I can't remember. Anyway, one of those islands out there. So if you want to check out this list, I'm going to find a way to link it by the time this video is published in the video description. I'm not sure if Google Drive is going to work because I'm sure this link will get quite a bit of traffic. But I'll have a way to link it so you can kind of run through it, manipulate it however you want to do it. Now, a few other cards worth considering here. The GTX 950 is decent, not as good as the 380X. The 380X is just, again, it's such a good card right now. I'm not sure how this video being released will affect that supply on the used market. If this video does really well and is shared all over the place, these cards might not exist for this price anymore. But at least as of time of filming, the 380X is really hard to beat. In fact, the GTX 970 here, even the 970 doesn't come close from a value proposition. So if this one gets trashed by this video or others, then maybe consider the 970 or the 960 or the 950, depending on your graphics card needs. A few AMD cards to touch on here. The R9 290. Yes, a lot of these on eBay are the blower 290. Okay, you need to keep that in mind. So it's an okay deal with respect to the other cards on this list as of time of filming, but it's gonna run probably pretty loud. A lot of these 290 coolers are not that great. These GPUs run super, super hot. If you've been gaming over the last decade, you probably know that. So, steer clear of this one if you can help it, but it is one that you probably will see, or it'll pop up on your radar when you look at this chart. GTX 980 Ti is not so great. It used to be a lot better. Obviously, it was kind of tag teaming with the GTX 1070. They're very similar performers. The 980 Ti, though, has, I think, 2 gigs less of VRAM, and 6 instead of 8 gigs. And it's going for about $400 right now on eBay, which isn't very good. GTX 750, don't even entertain it. A value of 10, that's not great. Now, the R9 Fury stood out. This is a better card. Some of these cards are even custom cooled. They're not custom cooled, but they have AIOs attached to them. Might be just the Fury X, I'm not sure. But you can look at these, but I actually recommend the Fury X over the Fury, at least given the prices I've seen, because these are only going for about $200. For whatever reason, the Furies are selling for more, but the Fury X's are getting 25.75 here on the value chart, which is pretty darn good. So a decent graphics score in Time Spy, but you're only paying $200 for it. So it's okay, right? It's again, not great with respect to what we were seeing 2 years ago, but compared to everything else on this chart, it's pretty darn good. One of the best. The R9 290X score 4,000 for 250. It's okay. The R9 Nano is a bit better, surprisingly. Didn't expect that. The Titan RTX, I mean, these cards are just ridiculous. Don't buy a Titan RTX if you're looking for value, ever. Now, GT 710. People buy these just because they're like, well, screw it, I have nothing else to buy, just buy a 710. You'd honestly probably be better off with, like, Vega graphics. Like assuming you can even find a Vega CPU or an AMD APU at this point. But a score of 192 for $50, I think this is the worst value card on this list. Surprisingly, I thought the Titans would be the worst value cards, but the GT 710 is just freaking awful. The GTX 780 Ti and 780 from the Kepler lineup are decent, worth considering if you're desperate, but again, there are better value propositions in this list. Now, this next chart I'm going to show you, and it's a visual chart, it's a scatter plot, it's not a bunch of numbers like before, so don't worry, is going to rely on MSRP again, right? Market suggested retail price, not ESP, which is what we were just looking at. So you'll see cards like the 3060 Ti way up here. On this kind of chart, you want to be as high as possible. This isn't really a measurement of price, although realistically, these cards over here to the right that are scoring higher, this score x-axis here is indicative of those 3D Mark Time Spy graphics scores we showed you earlier. If you're further to the right, you're probably going to pay a bit more, right? You pay for performance. But you can see that the 3060 Ti sits comfortably up here up top, and that's followed by the GTX 1650 Super, the RX 5500 XT is up here, which is surprising, the 3070, 5600 XT, 6800 XT, 6800, 3080, right? We knew that a lot of these cards were good at MSRP. And then I included this trend line, which kind of shows you the general trend of value given performance, or like the just sheer graphics score in Time Spy. I mean, this again will change depending on the benchmark suite you use, but we actually have a positive slope, which means that you're going to be paying a bit more per measurement of performance for a weaker card, right? So the weaker cards were not as good a value as the stronger cards at MSRP, and this accounts for tons of cards, right? Multiple generations, but that is a general trend. So if you buy a weaker card, it's going to have slightly less value associated with it because you're losing more performance than you are saving money. Now, this changes big time when we look at ESP. So when we shift from market suggested prices to what these cards are selling for right now on eBay, we can see that most of these cards are really, really low on the value chart, which is to be expected, right? Graphics card prices across the board right now are garbage, with a few exceptions. Now, this trend line is actually trending negative now, has a negative slope up here up top, and that means that you're actually getting less value when you spend more on average. Again, it's just a trend line, so it doesn't apply to every card on this list, But in general, given this current market, which is this is just mind-blowing to me, you're actually getting less value on average by spending more money on a graphics card. That's how jacked up this market is right now. The few exceptions up top here, the R9 Fury X is sitting comfortably, the R9 380X as well. Actually, if I go back to the previous chart, you'll see the Fury X here, it's on the same X-axis mark, right? It's somewhere, it's right here. It's pretty low. It's not a very powerful card, but it's right there. And I don't see, you actually probably can barely see my my cursor. I just realized that. But if we switch back to ESP, you can see that shoots straight up on the y-axis, but it remains at the same X value, right? Which is, that's how it should, because the 3D Mark times by graphics scores haven't changed between graphs. So the R9 Fury X shoots way up here. The R9 380X shoots way up here. There are a few cards in this range, between 15 and 20, which again are okay. The GTX 950, the R9 Fury, the R9 Nano, GTX 970, 780, 780 Ti. But for the most part, the two cards that have really gone under the radar, I just realized that my my camera window is blocking the R9 380X, but it's this one right here that's cut off. These two have been the best performers so far by a long shot. And I think a lot of this has to do with mining. So miners are all about value, kind of what this video is about. Miners are trying to get the highest hash rate for the least amount of power input, which means that their power bills will be lower, which means that their margins will be higher, right? They're trying to maximize profit just like anyone else in this industry. Now, as a byproduct of the increases in efficiency over time, newer graphics cards will be in higher demand by miners, generally speaking. Obviously, miners aren't going to want to go out and buy 3090s in bulk when a 3080 will get a similar hash rate for less than half of the price up front. But when we're talking about just the general trends of graphics cards over time, they have become more efficient as of late, and they don't cost as much as they used to, given the level of performance you would expect from a card in that range. So that is why I think, at least in part, why we're seeing this here. So the 6000 XT, right? A great mining card. 6800, good mining card. 2080 Ti, good mining card. And we're not talking about Bitcoin here. We're talking about cards that aren't reliant on ASICs anymore. ASICs do much better jobs at mining Bitcoin. But we're talking about Ethereum, other cryptocurrencies out there. These cards are generally going to be better performers. They don't suck as much power from the wall, in essence, and they give you a really high hash rate, which means you can mine more of said cryptocurrency per unit power draw. Now, two cards that are not very efficient by today's standards are the R9 380X and the R9 Fury X, and that is why I think miners are just kind of glossing over these. No doubt, miners are playing a role here. People want to blame exclusively miners, and that's simply not true. The demand for graphics cards across the board has probably never been higher, at least in recent years. But the Fury X, just one of those that, let's be honest, most gamers aren't looking for because they know it's very old. It typically runs very hot. And most miners aren't looking for it because it just pulls a ton of power from the wall for the level of performance that you're getting here. And I think that is a huge opportunity for a lot of gamers looking to upgrade right now, because maybe they're just too impatient to wait. That's fine. I know that I can't force people not to buy right now. In fact, funny that you mention it, if nobody was buying graphics cards right now, the price of graphics cards would plummet. Because everyone's buying them, the prices are staying elevated. That is supply and demand 101. It's probably pretty out the door, Greg. Why are you saying that? Well, I'm just saying, if you weren't so impatient, if I wasn't so impatient, if the market wasn't so impatient, the consumer side, the demand side of this chart was not so impatient, these prices would return to normal. But because demand is so high for most of these cards, we end up kind of scraping the bottom of the barrel for cards that we wouldn't normally go after. And the R9 Fury X is one of those cards. The R9 380X is another one of those cards. So depending on what resolution, what games you want to play, those are two worth considering, especially if you've not built a gaming PC before and you're looking to get into it for the first time. You need a graphics card, right? It just sucks gaming on Intel IGPs. It's awful, okay? UHD 620, 700, whatever, or even a APU from AMD, gaming on a 2200G or a 3200G, 2400G. It's just, it's better than nothing, but it's not ideal. An R9 380X would be a huge bump in the graphical horsepower potential that your system would have, and you'd only be paying a little over $100 for it. Yeah, it's not an extremely good deal, especially with respect to what we were seeing a few years ago, but it is something. And that's why I've made this video, because if you're desperate for a card and you don't want to get ripped off, I mean, the Fury X and the 380 are just two of the few cards that I think are actually worth considering, even still in this market, especially if you're impatient. But even if you just want something, maybe you want to just build another system for a friend or whatever, and again, you don't have a card to fall back on, you don't have an IGP to fall back on. A lot of Ryzen CPUs don't have integrated graphics processors. That's a problem, right? You have to have some kind of card, which is probably why the GT 710s and GT 1030s down here are so expensive. GT 1030s were selling for over $100 on eBay. It's freaking nuts. But anyway, that's probably why those graphics cards are in high demand relatively right now. But if you'd be willing to look back a few generations, check out cards like, I'll move myself out of the way here, like this R9 380, this R9 Fury X. I mean, it's a lot better, again, than integrated graphics, and it's something, right? It's something to tie you over during this really bizarre, crazy, expensive graphics card era. Now I'm going to end with one more chart. It's the normal distribution chart, and this is just another way to kind of break down the data that I showed you earlier in the Excel spreadsheet. So you can see it says graphics card values, normal distribution. This should have said ESP. So these are based on eBay sale prices currently. This is a frequency chart here to the left, not really as important as the bottom here. So a normal distribution is a way to break down the occurrences of data, how frequently certain values occur. In this case, we're looking for anywhere between 10 and 15. Our median was about, or actually our mean was roughly 12. I think it was 12.3. I'd have to go back and look at the Excel sheet. But anyway, I went ahead and marked it up for you guys to show you where a lot of these cards fall. So if you wanted to look at this from a statistics point of view, you would say that roughly 3 standard deviations outside the mean, which would be way over here at roughly 25, you have the R9 Fury X and the R9 380X. These are uncontested, by far the best value cards given 2021 prices, okay? You have some cards that are about a standard deviation outside the mean. So again, roughly 68%, you could say this is like statistic stuff, but there's a 68% of all data points fall between one standard deviation of the mean. So in this case, it would be 16, 17, 18, somewhere in that range, and 7, 8, 9, somewhere in this side here. And you get a lot of cards, right? The cards that are slightly better values, the GTX 970, 950, 780. I put 780 twice, but it's supposed to say 780 Ti. R9 Nano, R9 290, RX 470, RX 590. So if these cards over here to the far right are not available, these are the next cards to look for, okay? They are higher on the value side of things than most of these other cards in this list. Some that are fair, they're okay. They're still ripoffs with respect, again, to a year or two ago, but they're better than these over to the left, at least. You have like the RTX 2060, the RX 580, GTX 1070, surprisingly. I think it's because these cards were so hot even before this crazy market crisis. These are actually not very good deals right now. GTX 1080, same way. R9 390X, which is kind of weird, I think, just because there aren't many of these on eBay. The GTX 750 Ti, which is a pretty popular card, that one is not a very good deal. 1660 Super and the RX 6800. Now, the absolute worst deals, ones that you should never consider unless something drastic changes in the next few weeks or months. Titan V, Titan RTX, GT 1030, GT 710. Avoid these freaking cards like the plague, especially if you can't find these at MSRP. But even at MSRP, they are awful values. And then the RTX 3080, and for some reason I put RTX 3089, but this is supposed to say RTX 3090. These two Ampere cards as well are pretty awful deals. They're hyper inflated and are in actually really high demand. So it's just how the market reacts. So I hope this video has at least shed a bit of light onto some of the current graphics card market trends. Again, like I said in previous videos around this topic, I love looking at this data. I love crunching this data. It took weeks to gather all of this stuff. The longest part actually was gathering the eBay prices for 64 cards and then averaging those out, excluding any extreme outliers where people were like selling boxes. Those still show up in the eBay search inquiries and things. You have to exclude those, but make sure they're genuine sales, that they're working. You have to validate all of that before you take a fair average of each of these cards. So doing that took the longest, and that's why, again, I couldn't crunch it into a week window. It actually stretched into 2 weeks, I believe. But this was the hardest part. And then from there, you gather the 3D Mark time spy results, which wasn't too difficult. You could write a script to do that. Calculate the mean standard deviation. You can see how many standard deviations from the mean each of these cards lays out. So this 380x here was just over 3 standard deviations from the mean, which means it's an outlier. It's a very good value proposition with respect to everything else on this list. Same goes for the R9 Fury-X. This was the best at 25.75, 3.25 standard deviations from the mean. One of the worst, actually the worst, GT710 here, 2 standard deviations from the mean toward the left, which means it's a really bad value with respect to everything else on this list. But yeah, I'm going to link this down below again if you want to check it out. There's a lot more I'm sure you could pull from this chart, but I wanted to show you the extreme cases, show you what you really should be looking for if you absolutely must buy a graphics card right now. And I hate saying that because, I know people are going to buy cards anyway. There's really not much I can do there. But if you are going to buy a card, maybe entertain this chart, share it with your friends, share this video. I would appreciate that. This will help them make, I think, more informed purchase decisions rather than just kind of blindly going after whatever's hot right now, which in most cases is either Ampere or RDNA2. And as you can see from this chart, Ampere and RDNA2 are not very great value propositions right now. So be sure to leave a comment down below. Let me know what you thought about this video. Consider subscribing if you have not already for more videos like this, and leave a like. That would help with the algorithm quite a bit. I would appreciate that. My name is Greg. Thanks for learning with me.